The black veil was wrong. Lionel Norris noticed it the moment the woman stepped onto the platform at Abilene Station, Kansas, in the blazing summer of 1878. He had seen plenty of widows in his 31 years of living, women carved hollow by grief, women who moved through the world like ghosts still tethered to their dead. This woman moved nothing like that. She moved like someone running. Her steps were too quick, too deliberate, too controlled for a woman lost in mourning. The gloved hands gripping her traveling bag were white-knuckled. The veil, a length of black net draped over a modest bonnet, sat slightly askew, the kind of crooked that came from dressing in a hurry rather than from a morning spent weeping over a mirror. And her boots, black leather, good quality, were not widow's boots. They were walking boots, distance boots. Lionel leaned against the iron railing of the train car's entrance steps and watched her from beneath the shadow of his hat brim. He was supposed to be watching for something else entirely, a shipment of U.S. Marshal documentation that was being transported on this train, documentation that concerned a man named Cole Reeves, a wanted man, a dangerous man, a man with hidden motives and a dark past that stretched across 3 territories and left bodies in the dirt behind him. Lionel was a deputy U.S. Marshal assigned to escort that documentation safely from Abilene to Dodge City, and he did not have the luxury of distraction. But the woman in the widow's veil was not just a distraction. She was a trap waiting to spring. He knew it in his gut, in the place where 6 years of law work had deposited an instinct as reliable as a compass needle. Someone had sent her, or she was running from someone, and either way that black veil was a lie sewn over the truth. She handed her ticket to the conductor. Her voice was low, barely audible above the hiss of the engine, but Lionel caught the tremor in it, not grief but fear. Raw, living, present-tense fear. And then it happened. She lifted her gaze from the conductor, scanning the platform with the fast, sharp assessment of a woman calculating threat, and her eyes locked directly onto Lionel's. For exactly 1 second, the mask broke. Beneath the veil, her dark eyes went wide, her lips parted, and every ounce of the manufactured widow dissolved into someone else entirely, someone young, terrified, and blazingly, undeniably alive. Then the mask slammed back into place. She looked away. She stepped aboard the train. Lionel pushed off the railing, rolled the tension out of his shoulders, and followed her. He needed to understand who Sarah Yates really was before this train pulled out of Abilene. Because if she was connected to Cole Reeves, then every passenger on that train, including himself, was already in danger they didn't know about yet. And if she was running from Cole Reeves, well, that was a different kind of problem. One that would require him to choose between his duty and something he hadn't expected to feel again. Compassion, or perhaps something more complicated than that. 3 days earlier, Sarah Yates had been sitting in the back storeroom of her employer's dry goods store in the small town of Wichita, Kansas, stitching price tags onto bolts of calico cloth and wondering if this was the entirety of her future, when the door banged open and a man she had not seen in 4 years walked through it like a bad dream, refusing to stay buried. His name was Cole Reeves. He was 29, broad-shouldered, and handsome in the way that certain dangerous things are handsome, like a rattlesnake coiled in a sunbeam. He had been her late father's business associate, back when her father had been alive, and before Sarah understood what kind of business her father had actually been in. He had been charming once. He had been persuasive once. He had once, when Sarah was barely 20 and foolish in the way that inexperience makes people foolish, kissed her in a doorway in the rain and made her believe something was beginning. What had actually begun was a scheme. Her father had owed Cole Reeves a significant amount of money borrowed to cover gambling debts, and when her father died of a fever the previous winter, that debt had transferred to Sarah by Cole's own declaration, a declaration backed by no legal document she had ever seen, supported only by Cole's word and Cole's 2 hired men who carried guns on their hips and watched her with flat, patient eyes. The debt was $500. The way Cole proposed to collect it was not in currency. He wanted Sarah herself, Not out of love, she was past the age of believing that, but out of possession. Cole Reeves collected things: horses, land, women. He kept what he collected until he was finished with it, and then he discarded the remains and moved on. She had watched him do it to 3 other women in the years she had known him, and she was not willing to be the 4th. She had spent 2 months refusing him, quietly, carefully, always making sure never to be alone in a place from which she could not escape. She had moved lodgings twice. She had told no one because she had no one to tell. Her mother had died when Sarah was 12. She had no siblings. The friends she had made in Wichita were cordial, but not the kind who went to war with armed men on your behalf. And then 3 days ago, Cole had walked into the store and told her, with the warm, flat smile of a man who had already decided the outcome, that he was done being patient. She had until Sunday to come to him willingly, or he would present the debt claim to the county judge. A judge, he reminded her with that smile, who happened to owe Cole several favors of his own and have her hauled before the court. In 1878 Kansas, a woman with no property, no husband, no male guardian, and a declared debt against her name was in a very precarious legal position. It would not take much to destroy what little stability she had built. Sarah had sat very still while he spoke. She had kept her face neutral and her breathing slow. She had said, "I understand," in the voice she used when she did not intend to do what she was agreeing to. And the moment Cole walked out of that store, she was already calculating. She had $63 saved in a tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her rented room. Not enough for $500, not enough to simply pay it off, but enough perhaps to run. The problem was that Cole had people watching the roads. She knew this because she had tested it once before 3 months ago when she had considered leaving. She had hired a wagon to take her as far as Newton, and one of Cole's men had appeared at the edge of town before she was halfway there, just sitting on his horse and watching, not threatening, just watching, which was the whole point. The message was clear. There was nowhere to go on the open road that he would not see her, but the train was different. The Kansas Pacific Railway ran through Abilene and continued west toward Dodge City and beyond. If she could get to Abilene without being noticed, if she could board that train without Cole's men identifying her at the station, she could be in Dodge City before anyone realized she was gone. From Dodge she could find work, change her name, start again. The frontier was brutal, but it was large, and largeness was what she needed right now. The widow's disguise had come to her at 2 in the morning, the night before she left, while she was lying on her cot unable to sleep and staring at the ceiling. She had heard once, from the conductor's wife at a church social, that the railway had a policy of giving priority boarding and a degree of privacy protection to women in mourning, particularly widows traveling alone. It was a courtesy extended in that era as a kind of social grace, a recognition that grief was a vulnerable state that deserved shielding. If she could pass as a widow, she might get through the Abilene station without Cole's people looking too closely. Men tended to avert their eyes from grief, she had noticed. It made them uncomfortable, and Cole's men, for all their menace, were still men. She had borrowed the mourning veil and dark dress from the store's owner, Mrs. Haverson, telling the woman she needed them for a relative's funeral. She had not felt entirely good about the lie, but she had felt considerably worse about the alternative. She had packed 1 bag, taken her tin box, left 2 weeks' worth of wages on the counter as notice, and walked out of Wichita at 4 in the morning. She had taken the back roads, the ones that ran along the creek beds and through the tall grass, the ones that a person on horseback would not bother with unless they were specifically tracking someone on foot. It had taken her all of 1 day and most of the following night to cover the 35 miles to Abilene. Her feet had blisters by the time the rail station came into view. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her temples. She had bought her ticket with $8 from the tin box, second class to Dodge City. She had adjusted the veil in the reflection of the station window. She had told herself she looked like a grieving woman, not like a frightened one. She had almost believed it, right up until the moment she stepped onto that platform, and a pair of gray-blue eyes under the shadow of a dark hat looked straight at her and saw directly through every layer of the fiction she had constructed. The train car smelled of coal smoke, leather, and the particular human warmth of too many bodies in a confined space. Sarah found a window seat toward the middle of the car, set her bag in her lap like a shield, and fixed her eyes on the platform outside. Her heart had not slowed since that man's gaze had found hers. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know if he was Cole's, though something in his bearing said otherwise. He carried himself with the loose, self-assured stillness of authority, not the coiled, predatory tension she associated with Cole's hired men. There was a bad shape under his coat, she thought, though she could not be certain. A marshal, then, or a deputy. Which could be better or could be significantly worse, depending on whether Cole had gotten to the law in this county too. She heard the step at the end of the car, the particular weight of boots that knew where they were going, and she did not need to look up to know it was him. She looked up anyway. She had learned young that pretending danger wasn't there only gave it the advantage of surprise. He was tall, broader than she had registered from across the platform, with dark hair and the kind of face that had been made handsome, and then worked over by sun and weather, until it had become something more interesting than handsome, angular, watchful, marked in the corners of the eyes with the particular lines that came from squinting into long distances. He was wearing a canvas duster over a dark shirt, his hat held now in one hand, and his expression was entirely, pointedly neutral in the way that someone's expression is neutral when they are working very hard to keep it that way. He sat down across from her, not beside her, not in the row ahead. Directly across so that they were facing each other as the train shuddered and began to move out of Abilene, the platform sliding away beyond the window, the open Kansas sky spreading flat and enormous in every direction. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. His voice was low and even, and there was absolutely nothing apologetic in it. Sarah kept her posture perfect. "Thank you. Was it recent?" "Very. My condolences." He turned and looked out the window, and a slow, small, entirely not unkind smile crossed the corner of his mouth. "Must have been a quick illness." She waited. He turned back to her. "Only your boots aren't in mourning. Your left boot has dried creek mud on the heel, fresh enough that it's still flaking. You walked to Abilene. You didn't come from a funeral. You came from somewhere you were trying to leave without being seen." He paused. "And whoever you're running from knows this train route, which is why the veil." The silence between them lasted 4 full seconds. "You have quite a lot of opinions about a woman you don't know," Sarah said. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Lionel Norris," he said, and there it was, the quiet weight of the title, not a threat but not a promise either. "And you are—" Another pause, longer. The train swayed around them, the wheels finding their rhythm on the iron rails, the Kansas grassland rolling past the window in waves of gold and green. "Sarah Yates. Not Mrs. Anyone, I take it." "No," he nodded once, as though this confirmed rather than revealed something. "Are you in danger, Miss Yates?" The question was direct enough that it bypassed her prepared defenses entirely and found the truth underneath, which was that yes, she was, and she was terrified, and she had been alone with that terror for 3 days, and hearing someone ask it plainly, without cruelty, without judgment, was very nearly enough to undo her. She did not let it undo her. "That depends," she said carefully, "on whether you intend to tell anyone where I am." Lionel Norris studied her face for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not quite recognition, not quite pity, but something in the neighborhood of both. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document, glanced at it briefly, and tucked it away again. "I've got my own business on this train," he said. "Business that doesn't involve a woman in a borrowed widow's veil. But if someone comes looking for you before we reach Dodge City, I need to know who I'm dealing with. Not to stop you, to be prepared." Sarah looked at him steadily. In her experience, men who said not to stop you were frequently the very ones who stopped you, but there was something in the directness of his gray-blue gaze that made the usual calculations feel less reliable. He had seen through her disguise in under a minute. He had not used that knowledge to threaten her. He had asked if she was in danger. These were not the behaviors of a man who was Cole's. "His name is Cole Reeves," she said. "He may have a man at this station or the next, watching for me." Something shifted in Lionel's posture. A very small shift, almost imperceptible, but Sarah had spent years reading subtle changes in men's bodies because in her circumstances those shifts meant the difference between safety and its absence. "Cole Reeves," he repeated. "You know the name." "I know the name," he confirmed, and the neutrality in his voice had become something careful, something deliberate, and Sarah felt the ground of this conversation tilt slightly beneath her. "He's in the documentation," she said, guessing, watching his face. Lionel's jaw tightened fractionally. "What do you know about any documentation?" "Nothing. I guessed from your face just now." She watched him process that. "I told you his name because I thought you should know who might come onto this train. I'm not connected to whatever he's done that has the marshals interested. I'm connected to him only through a debt my father owed, which Cole is using to try to force my hand." She met his eyes. "I am not his accomplice. I am his intended victim. There is a difference." Lionel looked at her for a long, unblinking moment. "I know there's a difference," he said quietly. The train moved on through the Kansas afternoon, the sun falling at a long angle through the windows, laying bars of gold light across the floor of the car. They did not speak again for almost an hour, but it was not an empty silence. It was the kind of silence in which two people who have established a tentative and unexpected trust are quietly recalibrating their understanding of the situation they are both in. Lionel spent that hour with his attention split between the woman across from him and the rest of the car. He was watching for faces he knew, men who might be traveling as Cole's advance guard, ensuring that whatever shipment Cole was trying to intercept, the documentation that named names, detailed crimes, built the federal case that had been 2 years in construction, did not make it to Dodge City. He had been warned before boarding that Cole might have eyes on this train. He had not expected those eyes to wear a widow's veil and look at him with the direct, frightened, fiercely dignified gaze of a woman who had walked 35 miles alone through the Kansas night, rather than surrender to a man who thought he owned her. He glanced at her once while she was looking out the window, the veil pushed back now from her face, her profile clear against the golden light. She was 24, he estimated, perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled into a tight knot at the back of her head, and the kind of face that was not conventionally pretty so much as arrestingly particular strong brows, a straight nose, a mouth that in repose held something between determination and grief. He looked away before she could catch him looking. He had not looked at a woman with any sustained attention in a long time. Not since Anna. Not since the thing that he did not allow himself to think about except occasionally at night when the prairie was silent and the darkness was absolute, when he would let himself briefly acknowledge that the life he was currently living was built largely on the foundation of having lost the life he had expected to have. Anna had died in 1873, of typhoid fever, in a town called Ellsworth that no longer meant anything to him except that. They had been engaged for 8 months. He had been 26 and had believed, with the straightforward confidence of a young man who has not yet been properly hurt by anything, that the future was a place you walked toward and found waiting for you as planned. He had not been engaged since. He had, in the 6 years following, become very good at his job and very careful with his heart, which were related outcomes. He pulled his attention back to the rest of the train car. There were 12 other passengers in the second-class car. A family of 4: father, mother, 2 young boys who appeared to be homesteaders moving west, their belongings stacked around them in rough bundles. An older gentleman in a suit who had been reading the same page of the same newspaper since Abilene. A pair of younger men near the front of the car who had the dusty, sun-dried look of ranch hands traveling between jobs. A heavy-set woman in a large hat who had been asleep, since before the train departed. And a man in the back row, sitting alone, who had boarded after the conductor's whistle, and whom Lionel had not had time to properly assess before the confrontation of Sarah's eyes had reorganized his priorities. He looked at the man in the back row now. Dark coat, hat pulled low, hands in his lap, very still, in the way that hands are still when their owner is paying close attention to something while appearing not to. Lionel kept his own expression neutral and his body relaxed, and let his gaze drift back to the window as though he had noticed nothing. His hand, under the edge of his coat, checked the position of the Colt revolver on his hip. The man in the back row was Cole's. He was nearly certain of it. He turned back to Sarah, making the movement casual, conversational. "Miss Yates," he said, his voice pitched low enough to carry only across their small space, "when I stand up in approximately 2 minutes and walk toward the front of the car, I want you to keep your eyes on the window and not look toward the back row." She heard the shift in his tone and her own posture changed, almost imperceptibly. She understood what it meant. Someone's there. Possibly. He maintained his relaxed expression. "Stay exactly where you are. If anything happens that requires you to move quickly, move toward the front of the car, not the back. The next car forward is freight. It locks from inside. Can you manage that?" "Yes." Her voice was steady. He noted the steadiness and it registered somewhere in him. "Good." He stood up, stretched with manufactured laziness, tucked his hat under his arm and began walking toward the front of the car. He moved slowly, letting his eyes drift as though they were simply a man who needed to stretch his legs. He passed the ranch hands, the sleeping woman, the homestead family. He reached the front door of the car and turned. The man in the back row had shifted. His head was up. He was watching Sarah. Lionel walked back down the aisle, slower this time, and when he came level with the back row, he paused. "Mind if I take a look at your ticket?" he said, keeping his voice pleasant. The man looked up. He was perhaps 35, lean, with close-set eyes and a scar along his jaw. He reached into his coat pocket and Lionel's hand was already near his own hip, not drawing, just present, a reminder. The man produced a ticket. "Abilene to Newton, not Dodge City." "Thank you," Lionel said. He glanced at the man's coat lapel where a faint rectangular impression suggested the outline of a shoulder holster. He returned to his seat. "Newton," he told Sarah quietly. "He gets off at Newton. That's the next stop. Will he send word ahead when he gets off? That's the concern." She absorbed this with the contained stillness he was beginning to associate specifically with her. Not the blankness of someone who was not feeling things, but the controlled surface of someone who had learned to feel things without showing them. "Is there a way to prevent that?" she asked. "Not without creating a scene that draws more attention than I want on this train right now." He paused. "But I have a contact in Dodge City who can manage the forward situation once we arrive. The larger issue is whether Cole himself decides to board between here and Dodge." "He won't come himself," she said, and something in her tone made it clear this was knowledge rather than hope. "Cole sends people. He doesn't dirty his own hands. He would consider it beneath him. You know him well." "I knew him well enough to know I needed to leave." They sat in silence for a moment. The train was slowing as it approached the Newton stop. She could feel the slight drag in the rhythm of the rails, the subtle backward pressure of deceleration. "Miss Yates," Lionel said, and there was something different in his voice now, something slightly less official, slightly more human. "When we get to Dodge City, do you have somewhere to go?" She had been preparing for this question in some form since the conversation began. She had her answer ready. Yes, she had a plan, she would be fine, she did not need anything from anyone. But looking at him now, at the careful concern that was doing its best to stay professional and not quite managing it, she found that the prepared answer felt hollow. "I have $63 less $8 for the ticket," she said, "and no one waiting for me anywhere. Beyond that, no." He nodded slowly. "I have a friend in Dodge who keeps a boarding house, a woman named Marguerite Holloway. She's decent. She doesn't ask questions she doesn't need the answers to. I'll write you a note to give her when we arrive." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. "Why? Why what? Why would you do that? You don't know me. I boarded your train under a false identity. I'm connected, however, indirectly to a man you're building a federal case against." Lionel was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the Newton station was coming into view, a small platform, a handful of people, the usual flat Kansas geography spreading in every direction. "You walked 35 miles in the dark to get here," he said. "And you did it because a man was trying to use the law as a weapon against you." He looked at her directly. "That's not something I can see and then do nothing about. That's just not who I am." The train stopped at Newton. The man in the back row stood, collected nothing. He had brought no bag and walked off the train without looking at either of them. He disappeared into the small crowd on the platform. Sarah watched him go. "He'll have the telegraph office send a message within the hour." "Yes," Lionel agreed. "Which means I need to get the documentation off this train before it becomes a target." This, she realized, was the moment to say nothing, to look out the window, to let him handle his business while she handled hers. They were strangers. They had exchanged confidences out of mutual necessity. That was all. But she heard herself say, "Is there anything I can do to help?" He looked at her, startled out of the professional composure for just a moment. The surprise in his face was oddly touching. "You're offering to help a federal marshal while running for your own life," he said. "You offered to help a woman in a borrowed widow's dress while managing a federal transport operation," she returned. "We can call it equal." That small, not quite a smile appeared again at the corner of his mouth. It changed his whole face, and she felt something shift in her chest, warm and unwelcome and impossible to entirely dismiss. "The documents are locked in the mail car," he said. "I need to move them to a less obvious location before whoever Cole has in Dodge City receives that telegraph message and starts making plans. The mail car lock is standard, a persuadable lock, and if I move the documents to my personal bag, they travel in second class, which is the last place anyone would look for federal transport documents. And you need a second set of eyes while you make the transfer," she said. "And someone to knock on the mail car door and keep the clerk talking for approximately 3 minutes while I handle the interior. I can do that. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She met his eyes steadily. "But I want Cole Reeves to end up in a federal prison, and if those documents help make that happen, then I want them to reach Dodge City safely. That's not a difficult calculation." He studied her face once more with that careful, thorough attention, as if he were reading something that required close focus. "All right," he said. "When the train stops for water at Salina in 40 minutes, that's when we move." They spent the 40 minutes between Newton and Salina in a kind of careful, circling conversation that moved gradually away from the logistics of their respective predicaments and into the territory of ordinary human exchange. The kind that happens when two people are sitting close enough to speak quietly, and the situation around them has created an unexpected intimacy. He told her that he had grown up in Missouri, that his father had been a blacksmith, that he had come west at 19 looking for land and had found law instead. She told him about her years in Wichita, about Mrs. Haverson's store, about the particular grinding dailiness of making a life as a single woman with no family and limited options in a small Kansas town. She did not tell him about Cole's kiss in the doorway 4 years ago. Some embarrassments were too close to the bone. He did not tell her about Anna. But she noticed the way his expression closed fractionally when she asked if he had family waiting for him in Dodge, and she understood that there was a closed door there, a room he did not open for strangers, possibly for anyone. The train pulled into Salina for its water stop with a great exhale of steam and the grinding slowness of a large machine reluctantly coming to rest. Lionel stood, touched the brim of his hat in a small, oddly courtly gesture and said, "Give me 90 seconds before you follow. The mail car is 3 cars back." She gave him 90 seconds. She counted them. Then she gathered herself, left her bag on the seat, a deliberate signal that she was coming back, that she was not running, a small piece of trust she hadn't quite planned to offer, and walked to the end of the car. The mail car clerk was a young man named Peters who was, as Lionel had suggested he might be, profoundly susceptible to the attentions of a woman who was willing to ask him interested questions about the operations of railway postal service. Sarah leaned against the door frame and said, "Excuse me, I am so sorry to trouble you, but I wondered if you could help me understand whether a letter posted from Wichita last week would have already reached Dodge City by now." And the young man Peters straightened up with the energy of someone who had been waiting for exactly this invitation, and began explaining the intricacies of the rail mail system with enormous enthusiasm. Behind him, through the door he had obligingly left ajar, she heard the soft, precise movements of a man who knew how to move without announcing himself. 3 minutes and 20 seconds later, Peters was still talking, and Lionel stepped out of the mail car with nothing visibly different about him except a slight additional bulk under his coat where his interior pocket had been filled. "Thank you so much," Sarah told Peters warmly. "You've been extremely helpful." Peters looked genuinely bereft to see her go. She and Lionel walked back to the second-class car separately and sat down in their facing seats as the train lurched back into motion from the Salina stop. And for a moment they simply looked at each other, and then something broke in both of them simultaneously. Not laughter exactly, but something lighter than either of them had been allowing themselves. A release of tension that wanted to come out as something other than stress. "You have a gift for extracting information," he said, dry. "I spent 3 years selling dry goods," she said. "I know how to be interested in things that do not interest me. Peters will be telling that story for a year. Peters is welcome to it." She felt, suddenly and unexpectedly, almost cheerful. She recognized the feeling as a form of giddiness that was partly relief and partly something else, something that had to do with the man sitting across from her, the particular quality of his attention, the way he had looked at her when she offered to help him as though she had said something surprising and good. She put the feeling aside carefully. She had enough complications. The train moved through the afternoon into the early evening, the sky going vast and amber over the Kansas plain, the light thickening to the color of old honey. Lionel bought 2 cups of coffee from the food vendor who came through the car at 6 o'clock and handed her one, and she accepted it and wrapped both hands around the tin cup and thought that it was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in quite a long time, which said something about the texture of the recent past. "Tell me more about the debt," he said. It was not a demand. It was offered as an opening, she told him. All of it, her father's gambling, the borrowed money, Cole's claim, the judge in Wichita, the watching men on the road, the tin box under the floorboard. She told it plainly, without embellishment, the way she would have told it to a person of legal authority, which he was, but she found herself telling it also the way she would have told it to someone she trusted, which was something she did not do easily and had not done in a long time. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The debt claim," he said. "Do you have any documentation of it? Anything in writing?" "Nothing. Cole claims there's a note in my father's handwriting, but I have never seen it. It's possible the note exists and is legitimate," he said carefully. "It's also possible it was fabricated. If it was fabricated, a handwriting examination would establish that. But the more important point is that even if the debt is real, the manner in which Cole is trying to collect it through implicit coercion and threats rather than through proper legal channels is itself actionable. A judge not in Cole's pocket would see that. I don't know any judges not in Cole's pocket." "I know several," he said simply. She looked at him. "There's a federal judge in Dodge City," he continued. "Judge Harlan Pruitt. He's not in anyone's pocket. He would hear this. You're suggesting I file a complaint." "I'm suggesting that running was the right choice to get you out of immediate danger, but that it doesn't solve the underlying problem. Cole will have a legal claim against your name as long as that claim is uncontested." He paused. "You said you wanted him in federal prison. The documents I'm carrying are part of a case against him for wire fraud and conspiracy to obstruct federal processes. They will not cover the matter of your father's debt, But if Cole is federally charged, his ability to pursue any civil claim against you becomes substantially complicated, particularly if a federal judge has simultaneously received a sworn statement from you regarding the coercion. She sat with this for a long moment. She had been thinking of Dodge City as an escape, a disappearance, the beginning of an anonymous new chapter. She had not been thinking of it as a place where she could turn around and fight back. The idea was frightening. The idea was also, underneath the fear, something that felt like electricity. You think it would work? I think it gives you a significantly better outcome than spending the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, he said. And I think you are more than capable of it. There was a quality to his voice when he said the last sentence that was not professional assessment. It was something personal, something he had offered without entirely intending to, and she felt it register in the space between them and saw him register that she had registered it, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The last of the evening light faded from the windows. The lamp at the end of the car was lit by the porter, casting the interior of the train in a warm, unsteady amber glow. Outside, the Kansas night was absolute dark prairie, scattered stars, the faint shapes of distant farmhouses moving past like afterthoughts. He fell asleep before 9 o'clock, or appeared to. He had that particular quality of a man whose sleep was trained, a light and functional sleep rather than the deep absence of someone truly at rest. His head was angled slightly to the side, his hands rested open in his lap, and the lines of his face in sleep were less guarded, younger-looking, the years of careful watchfulness temporarily released. Sarah stayed awake. She had too many things moving in her mind, the fear that was still there, dimmed but not gone, the plan that Lionel had outlined, growing in her head from a suggestion to a possibility to something she could see with increasing clarity, and the man himself, who had in the space of several hours become something she did not have a ready category for. Not exactly a protector because she had managed her own protection. Not exactly a friend because they did not know each other well enough. Something newer and more ambiguous than either. She looked at him in the lamplight and thought about how unexpected it was to run away from one thing and find yourself running towards something else you had not planned for and could not yet name. She looked out at the dark prairie and told herself to be careful. She was 24 years old and she was on a train to Dodge City with a U.S. Marshal and $63 in a tin box and a sworn enemy with a fabricated debt and the beginnings of something that felt terrifyingly like hope. The train arrived in Dodge City at 11:37 at night, under a black sky thick with stars, the town's oil lamps burning warm and yellow in the darkness, the smell of cattle and dust and wood smoke meeting them as they stepped onto the platform. Lionel was awake and alert the moment the train began its final deceleration, his hand confirming the position of his Colt in the unhurried, habitual way of a man who had done this so many times it required no conscious thought. He scanned the platform through the window before standing, identifying faces, cataloging threats, finding nothing immediately alarming. 3 figures he recognized as local law, a scatter of late-night arrivals, a freight handler loading a cart. He stood, retrieved his traveling bag and looked at Sarah, who had already gathered her own bag and was watching him with the alert attention of someone who had learned in the last several hours to take their cues from his posture. "Stay close until we've cleared the platform," he said quietly. She nodded and moved naturally to walk beside him rather than behind, which he noticed and filed away as another data point in the growing picture of who she was, not a woman who deferred, but a woman who was capable of cooperation based on the merits of a situation. They moved through the platform quickly. He kept his hand free at his side and his eyes moving. She kept pace easily, her dark bag over one arm and her chin up in the particular posture she had whenever she was frightened and determined not to show it. He was beginning to recognize that posture. They cleared the platform without incident. On the far side of the station, he stopped at a telegraph window and sent 2 messages, one to his supervising marshal in Kansas City, confirming the document's arrival, and one to Judge Pruitt's office requesting a morning meeting. He wrote the second message quickly, aware of Sarah watching. "Is that for the case?" she asked. "Partly," he said. "The other part is for you." She was quiet for a moment. "You move quickly. Problems tend not to improve with delay." He took her to Marguerite Holloway's boarding house, which was on a quiet street 3 blocks from the main row, a 2-story wooden building with a covered porch and a lamp left burning in the front window. Marguerite herself answered the door, a stout, sharp-eyed woman of about 50, gray hair pinned in a no-nonsense arrangement, wearing a house robe and clearly not at all put out by the late hour. "Lionel Norris," she said, in the tone of a woman who has long since ceased to be surprised by what appeared on her doorstep. "Who is this?" "Miss Sarah Yates," he said. "She needs a room, a meal, and the kind of privacy you're good at providing." Marguerite looked Sarah over with the swift, accurate assessment of someone who had housed many women in complicated circumstances. "Can you pay?" "Yes," Sarah said. "Then come in." She stepped aside and looked at Lionel. "You'll want breakfast." 7 o'clock, he said. "I have a meeting with Judge Pruitt at 8. "The both of you?" He glanced at Sarah. She was looking at him with the question in her eyes. "If Miss Yates is willing," he said. "I'm willing," she said. Marguerite made a sound that was not quite a hum and not quite a comment and showed Sarah upstairs to a clean room with a brass bed and a window that looked out over the quiet street. She left a covered plate of cold roast beef and bread on the side table, a thoughtful gesture that Sarah was more grateful for than she could have expressed, having realized only now that she had not eaten in most of a day. She sat on the edge of the bed and ate, and listened to the sounds of Dodge City settling into its late-night rhythm below the window, the distant sound of a piano from somewhere on the main street, a horse on the road, someone's laughter, the city's nighttime vocabulary. She thought about Cole Reeves, who would know by morning that she had not been at the Newton stop, would know by afternoon at the latest that she was in Dodge City, would be calculating what came next. She thought about Lionel Norris, in whatever room he occupied in this building or another, carrying federal documents in his coat pocket and a federal case in his hands, and the unbidden, inconvenient weight of having decided, somewhere on that train, to take an interest in her survival. She lay down on the brass bed without undressing and fell asleep before she finished the thought that had begun with his name. The meeting with Judge Harlan Pruitt the following morning was nothing like what Sarah had expected. She had expected the cold, adversarial atmosphere of official legal proceedings, the particular intimidating sterility of men in rooms making decisions about other people's lives. What she found instead was a small office crowded with books and paper, and the smell of pipe tobacco, occupied by a compact man of 60 with white hair and a blunt, interested face, who listened to her account of Cole Reeves, and the supposed debt with the focused, non-reactive attention of someone who had made a career out of hearing difficult things without flinching. Lionel sat beside her but said almost nothing during her account. When she had finished, he presented the documentation from the coat pocket, the federal case materials, and outlined the charges being brought against Reeves. Judge Pruitt had clearly been briefed on elements of this already. He read through several pages with quick, practiced eyes and then set them down and tapped the desk with one finger. "The debt claim," he said to Sarah. "You say the note, the supposed written acknowledgement from your father, has never been produced. Cole claims to have it, but I have never seen it. And the tactics used to collect the station men on the roads, the approach to the local judiciary, the implied coercion. All of it I can state under oath." Pruitt looked at Lionel. "You believe her testimony is reliable?" There was a fraction of a pause, just the length of one breath, and in it Sarah felt something that was more than professional assessment passing between her and the judge's question and Lionel's answer. "Yes," Lionel said. "I believe it completely." Pruitt nodded. "I'll issue a protective order today preventing anyone from acting on the alleged debt claim pending a full hearing. I'll also send a formal inquiry to the Wichita court regarding that judge's handling of matters concerning Cole Reeves." He looked at Sarah. "Miss Yates, you will need to remain available in Dodge City for the duration of the preliminary proceedings. Are you able to do that?" "Yes," she said, and meant it. "Good." He closed the folder in front of him. "Lionel, the federal charges go forward next month. I want Miss Yates' statement incorporated as supplementary testimony regarding Reeves's pattern of coercion. Her case is a piece of the larger picture." "Understood," Lionel said. They stepped out of the courthouse into the bright morning, the Dodge City street busy with its daytime traffic, wagons, horses, merchants, the whole busy material life of a cattle town in full swing. Sarah stood on the steps for a moment, breathing the warm dust and grass air, feeling something she could only identify as a loosening, some long-held tightness in her chest beginning, cautiously, to ease. "It's not over," Lionel said beside her. It was not a discouragement, it was honesty. "No," she agreed, "but it's different." He looked at her sideways. In the morning light his face was more open than she had seen it on the train, less guarded, the professional composure temporarily set aside in the less formal context of standing on courthouse steps. "You did well in there," he said. "I told the truth," she said. "That's not the same as doing well." "It is, when telling it is difficult." She looked at him for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. Last night on the train, when you said I should consider staying and fighting back instead of just running," she paused. "Did you say that because it was strategically sound or because you wanted me to stay?" The morning traffic moved around them. A horse shied at something across the street. Somewhere a door slammed. Lionel looked at her with the same direct, unguarded steadiness she had first seen on the train platform, the gaze that went through veils. "Both," he said. She held his gaze. "That's honest. I said I believed your testimony was reliable. You might extend the same confidence to other things I say." It was not a declaration. It was not a rush of emotion or a dramatic gesture. It was a quiet, precisely placed truth, offered in the same tone he used for everything else, steady, direct, without performance, and it landed in her chest with the weight of something that mattered. "All right," she said in the same quiet register. "I will." They stood on the courthouse steps in the Dodge City morning for another moment, not touching, not saying anything more, but in the space between them something had been acknowledged that had not been acknowledged before, and the day was different for it. The weeks that followed were a complicated, layered, often uncomfortable process of legal proceedings, practical reestablishment, and the gradual, cautious movement toward each other that both of them undertook with the particular care of people who had each been hurt before and were not willing to move carelessly. Sarah found work at a small millinery on the main street, run by a woman named Mrs. Chen, who had come west from San Francisco 10 years earlier, and had the particular no-nonsense pragmatism of someone who had remade her life from nothing, and had strong opinions about women who were capable of doing the same. The work paid better than the dry goods store in Wichita, the hours were not brutal, and Mrs. Chen, who knew Marguerite Holloway, extended Sarah a credit arrangement for her first month's rent, while the legal proceedings occupied her time and attention. Lionel remained in Dodge City for the duration of the preliminary federal hearing preparation, which was longer than he had initially planned. He told himself this was because the case required his presence, which was true. He told himself less clearly, but with equal accuracy, that he had no particular urgency about returning to the road now, that there was something here worth staying for. They had dinner together 4 times in the first 2 weeks, at Marguerite's table with 3 other boarders present, which was entirely proper and also, Sarah suspected, slightly strategic on Marguerite's part, who seemed to have decided views about how things should proceed and was facilitating accordingly. On the 5th evening, they walked together to the eastern edge of town after dinner and stood at the fence line where Dodge City ended and the open prairie began, looking out at the sky going red and violet in the west, and Lionel told her about Anna. He told it quietly, without drama, the way he told most things, her name, the fever, the 8 months, the particular way the future had simply failed to arrive as expected. He told her about the 6 years of carefully structured solitude afterward, the marshaling work that was real and meaningful and also conveniently all-consuming. He told her all of this looking out at the prairie rather than at her, which she understood and did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, "Thank you for telling me." He looked at her then. "I wanted you to know why I'm—" He stopped, searching for the word. "Careful," he settled on. "I'm not cold, I'm just careful." "I know," she said. "I am too." "What made you careful?" he asked. She thought for a moment. Not about Cole's kiss in the doorway, that was a small embarrassment, not a wound. But there had been other things. The specific loneliness of a woman entirely on her own in a world not designed for her convenience. The years of watching other people have what she had imagined for herself while she stitched price tags on calico and tried to find something like contentment in sufficiency. "Being alone for a long time," she said finally. "It makes you careful about hoping for things." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the fence rail and took her hand, which was the first time he had touched her deliberately, and her breath caught in a way she hoped was not entirely visible. "I think," he said, "that we are both considerably better at being careful than at being happy, and I think it might be worth trying the second one for a change." She looked down at their joined hands on the fence rail and then up at his face, which in the last light of the prairie sunset was open in a way she had not yet seen. The watchfulness set down, the careful composure gone, just the man underneath looking at her with something simple and true and slightly frightened. "I think you might be right," she said. He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles, which was very proper and somehow also the most intimate thing anyone had done in her recent memory, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle somewhere in the center of her chest, where it remained for the rest of the evening. Cole Reeves was arrested in Wichita on a Thursday afternoon in late August 1878, 6 weeks after Sarah had stepped onto that platform in Abilene wearing a borrowed widow's veil. 2 federal marshals executed the warrant that had been issued following the completion of the Dodge City preliminary hearing. The charges were federal wire fraud, conspiracy to obstruct federal processes, and following the submission of Sarah's sworn statement, and additional testimony from 2 other women in Wichita who came forward once word spread that someone had filed a complaint, criminal intimidation and coercion. Lionel received the telegram confirming the arrest while Sarah was at work. He walked to the millinery and waited outside until she came to the door at her lunch hour, and he handed her the telegram without preamble. She read it twice. Then she looked up at him with an expression he had never quite seen on her before. Not the contained, controlled composure of their first meetings, not the cautious warmth of the past weeks, but something fully open, unguarded, a face with nothing over it. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, which she had not done before, and he put his arms around her, and they stood on the Dodge City sidewalk at midday, while the traffic of the town moved around them, and he felt the shaking in her that was not crying but was something close to it. The release of something held too long and too tightly, the body's response to a threat it had been bracing against for months finally being removed. He held her and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that added to what was already being said by the fact of him being there, and her being there, and the telegram in her hand that meant Cole Reeves was going to face justice. "It's really over," she said into his shoulder, her voice muffled and unsteady. "The worst of it is over," he said. "There'll be more proceedings, testimony in person likely when it goes to full trial, but Cole can't reach you from custody." She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were bright and not quite dry, and she looked entirely, unreservedly herself in a way that was different from every previous version of herself she had offered him, and he thought that this was the version he would choose every time if he were given the choice. "Lionel," she said. "Yes." She kissed him. It was brief and deliberate, and she was looking at him while she did it, and then she stepped back with a faintly self-conscious expression that was completely unlike her usual composure and said, "I've been wanting to do that for about 3 weeks." That's approximately the same timeline as mine, he said. She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, bright, and he thought that this was also a version of her he would choose every time, possibly even more than the serious one, though that version had her own considerable quality. I should go back inside, she said. Yes. Will you come to dinner tonight? If Marguerite will have me. Marguerite has been expecting you for at least 2 weeks, Sarah said dryly. I believe she's keeping a plate warm in permanent anticipation. He did come to dinner that evening, and the evening after that, and the one following, and if Marguerite had opinions about the developing situation, she expressed them solely through the quality and quantity of the food she produced on these occasions, which was considerable. They talked on those evenings about everything, their childhoods, his Missouri, her Kansas, his years as a marshal, her years of managing solitude, the books they had read, the things they believed, the futures they had each privately imagined and then privately stopped imagining. He was funny in a dry, quiet way that emerged only when he was relaxed, and she discovered that she made him laugh more easily than he seemed to expect, which delighted her in a way she did not bother to conceal. She was direct and opinionated, and he was the first man she had encountered who seemed to genuinely appreciate rather than be unsettled by those qualities. He told her once in October, sitting on Marguerite's porch after dinner with coffee cups going cold in the autumn air, that she was the most plainly honest person he had met in years. I take that as a compliment, she said. It's the highest one I know how to give, he said. She looked at him sideways. Higher than pretty. I have said approximately nothing about pretty, he said carefully. I have noticed, she said, very carefully, that you have said approximately nothing about it. I was attempting to be respectful of the pace of things. Lionel, yes, you are allowed to say I am pretty. He turned to look at her full on. You are the most remarkable-looking woman I have seen in a very long time, he said in the same unhurried, honest tone he applied to everything, and I have been aware of that since approximately the moment on the Abilene platform when you looked at me through that veil and every particle of the widow's disguise fell away, and I saw who you actually were. She felt the warmth of this move through her in a slow wave. And who was that? Someone real, he said simply. In a world that has a great deal of performance in it, you were real. Even while pretending to be someone else, you were real. She put her hand on his arm. He covered it with his own. The October night was cool and quiet, and the stars over Dodge City were as many and close as they always were over the open prairie, the sky undimmed by the small lights of the town. I think, she said carefully, that I am in love with you. The silence that followed was one of the charged, significant silences she was learning to read in him, not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but of someone deciding how much of what they felt to put into words and whether the words could carry the weight. I know I am in love with you, he said. I have known it with increasing certainty since the afternoon we stood on the fence at the edge of town, and you told me that being alone for a long time makes you careful about hoping for things. He paused. Because I understood exactly what you meant, and I thought that here was someone who has been in the same room as me, the room of trying to be sufficient to oneself and not quite succeeding, and that was a better form of recognition than I had expected to find. She leaned her head against his shoulder and let out a long breath, and his arm came around her, and they sat like that while the prairie night deepened around them. He asked her to marry him in November, on a Sunday afternoon, at the eastern fence line where they had stood the first time he had taken her hand, the prairie in its autumn colors around them, the sky a cold, bright blue. He did it with no elaborate ceremony. He was not an elaborate ceremony kind of man, which she had long since established, but with a directness and a gravity and a specific personalness that meant more to her than ceremony would have. He said that he wanted to spend his life with the woman who had walked 35 miles in the dark to refuse surrender, who had offered to help him with federal documentation while running for her own safety, who was honest to the point where honesty was sometimes startling, and who laughed in a way that had reorganized his understanding of what daily life could feel like. She said yes before he had finished the sentence. They were married the following February, 1879, in Dodge City, at the small white church on the western side of town. Marguerite Holloway stood with Sarah. A colleague and friend of Lionel's, a deputy marshal named Thomas Cade, who had ridden with him for 4 years, stood with Lionel. Mrs. Chen brought flowers from the shop. Judge Prout, who had by this point developed the proprietary fondness of someone who felt he had played a supporting role in the outcome, attended and sat in the front row and appeared deeply satisfied with the proceedings. Sarah wore a dress that was not black, not borrowed, and not a disguise. It was a pale gray wool with ivory lace at the collar and cuffs that Mrs. Chen had helped her select, and that Lionel, when he saw her coming down the church aisle, looked at for approximately 2 seconds before looking at her face, where he stayed for the rest of the ceremony. Cole Reeves went a trial in March of that year. Sarah testified. She did it in the same composed, direct manner with which she did most things, and she did not look at Cole while she spoke, not because she was afraid of him, but because she had decided that he did not merit that much of her attention. He was convicted on all major counts and sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary. The Wichita judge who had been in his pocket resigned his position before proceedings against him could be formalized. The 2 women from Wichita who had come forward received compensation through a civil process that Prout facilitated. The supposed debt note was produced during the trial. A document examiner testified that the handwriting did not match the samples of her father's writing that Sarah had preserved. The claim was formally dismissed. It was over. Completely, thoroughly, finally over. Lionel accepted a permanent posting in Dodge City as senior deputy marshal, which meant that the road life that had defined his previous 6 years was replaced by something more bounded and, as it turned out, more deeply satisfying. He still rode out on cases. He still carried his Colt and his badge with the same practiced ease. But he came home from those cases now to a house on a quiet street, a house they had rented initially, and then, by midsummer 1879, purchased. A 2-story white wooden house with a covered porch and a vegetable garden that Sarah cultivated with the same methodical determination she applied to everything, and a large back room that Lionel had converted into a proper study, and that she had immediately colonized with books and mending in equal proportion. Their life together had the quality she had not known to hope for, not the dramatic romance of stories, not the breathless, event-filled first weeks sustained past their natural duration, but something sturdier and more sustaining, a daily closeness that was funny and serious and occasionally exasperating, and always, underneath all of it, warm. He had a habit of leaving his hat on the kitchen table that she found persistently irritating. She had a habit of reorganizing the study bookshelves in ways that made no sense to him, by color rather than subject, which he complained about regularly and secretly found charming. They argued about these things with the contained, low-temperature efficiency of 2 people who argued productively. Not to wound, but to establish, not to dominate, but to negotiate, arriving consistently at outcomes that worked for both of them. On the evenings when a case was difficult, when the world of his work had pressed too close to the darkness it required him to look at, he would come home and sit on the porch, and she would bring him coffee and sit beside him and say nothing, because she had learned that in those moments he needed presence rather than conversation, and she was capable of giving presence with a generosity that he told her once, in the quieter kind of sincerity that was sometimes between them, was the thing he was most grateful for. On the evenings when the legal proceedings of the past year pressed too close to her, which they did, occasionally, in the form of nightmares or sudden unexpected memories of Cole's flat, warm smile and the particular helplessness of that time, he would sit with her in exactly the same way, and she thought that being known and being stayed with by someone who chose that knowingly was the specific thing she had spent years trying not to want because wanting it had felt too close to vulnerability. She had been wrong about that. Vulnerability in the right hands was not a danger, it was a foundation. In early 1880, Sarah discovered she was expecting a child. She told Lionel on a Tuesday evening, in the kitchen, in the middle of a mundane conversation about whether they needed to replace the water pump handle, which struck her later as perfectly appropriate. The most significant things had a way of arriving in the middle of the ordinary. His face did something she had not seen it do before. It went briefly, completely unguarded in a way that went past even the open expression of their most intimate moments. A flash of something so pure it was almost painful to look at. And then he covered the ground between them in 2 steps, and held her face in both his hands, and looked at her in a way that required no words, and she laughed, because she was happy, and because his expression was so uncharacteristically undone, and because this was exactly the life she had not let herself believe was possible on those lonely nights in Wichita. Their son was born in October 1880, a healthy, insistent presence who arrived in the world with the apparent intention of making himself felt, which as far as Lionel was concerned was exactly appropriate. They named him James Robert Norris, James for Lionel's father and Robert for Sarah's, a bridging of 2 families across their respective distances, a gesture toward continuity. Lionel held his son on the first evening, in the rocking chair in the study, while Sarah slept, and sat with the small weight of him in the lamplight and thought about the particular quality of life's turns. How the thing you could not have imagined finding was so frequently the thing that proved most worth having found, and how the road there could look like a series of accidents until you looked backward at it from the right distance and saw that each piece had been necessary. Each unexpected encounter a part of the architecture. He thought about a train platform in Abilene and a woman in a black veil with creek mud on her boots, and the way she had looked at him when the mask broke. Just for 1 second, the flash of someone real in a world of performance, looking out at him with frightened, brilliant, entirely undefeated eyes. He was glad he had noticed the boots. The months that followed James's birth were their own particular education, the learning of new rhythms, the rearrangement of priorities that a child necessitates, the discovery that the patience and steadiness they had each developed individually, in their different forms of managed solitude, turned out to be exactly the qualities that made them good at this new, demanding, entirely different thing. They were tired in ways they had not been before. They were also, in ways that neither of them had been prepared for, continuously astonished. James Norris at 6 months had opinions. He had opinions about the pace of being carried, the timing of meals, the appropriate proximity of his parents, and the general management of his world, and he expressed these opinions with the full commitment of someone who expected to be heard. Sarah, watching Lionel hold the baby at 3 in the morning during a particularly vigorous expression of opinion, and seeing the effortful seriousness with which Lionel took his son's concerns, thought that this was one of the best things she had ever seen. "He is very forthcoming," Lionel said, not for the first time, with the careful neutrality he reserved for things he was actually finding deeply funny. "He gets it from you," Sarah said. "I have never expressed an opinion at 3 in the morning at this volume. You have expressed opinions at this volume on at least 2 occasions that I can recall clearly. That was court testimony," he said. "It is different." She buried her face in her pillow to muffle her laughter, and he jostled James gently and felt the small complaining body gradually ease, the volume reduce, the tension in those tiny shoulders release as sleep approached again. And he thought, not for the last time, that this was the work he was most glad to be doing. By the time James was a year old, Thomas Cade had been promoted to Marshal proper, which meant that Lionel's workload redistributed in ways that gave him more regular hours and more evenings at home. The house on the quiet street had become a point of social gravity in their corner of Dodge City. Marguerite came to Sunday dinners regularly, as did Mrs. Chen and the young women from the millinery, as did Prude on the occasions when his schedule permitted, as did the various colleagues and neighbors who had been drawn into the orbit of two people who turned out, when properly settled, to be the kind of couple around whom others naturally gathered. It was not a small life. It was not a quiet life in any of the ways Sarah had feared her life might become quiet, the grinding sameness of stitching price tags in a back room, the endless managed loneliness of sufficiency without warmth. It was full. It was genuinely, texturally, specifically full, in the way that only comes when the things filling it are actually the right things. Cole Reeves served his sentence. Released in 1885, he found that the world had reorganized in his absence. The particular networks of obligation and intimidation that had given him his power in Wichita had dissolved while he was away. The judge he had owned was gone. The properties he had held were in other hands. He went to Colorado, from what Sarah heard through a chain of reliable informants, and appears to have spent the remaining years of his life in significantly reduced circumstances, which was not exactly justice, but was at least consequence. Sarah did not think about him very much by then. He had been a danger and then a case and then a concluded case and then a chapter she had turned past. Her life had been going very well for several years by the time she heard his name last, and had the kind of deep-rooted contentment that makes old threats feel genuinely distant. In the spring of 1883, when James was 2.5 and conducting an enthusiastic investigation of everything within his reach in the Norris household, Sarah told Lionel she was expecting their second child. This time she told him at dinner, quite deliberately, because she wanted to see his face in full light. His face did the thing again. The complete, helpless, unhidden thing that she loved fiercely and specifically, the particular expression that was only his and only for moments of pure-felt significance. A second one, he said. The same general process as the first, she confirmed. Yes. I am aware of the process, he said, in the dry tone that meant he was very moved and dealing with it via understatement. I am simply pleased, she offered. Extremely, he said. He reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture he had made at the fence rail in Abilene and at countless subsequent moments, the first touch that had said something he hadn't yet put into words, and every time since then a continuation of that same said thing. Their daughter was born in November of that year and was named Clara, for no particular ancestral reason, but because the name, when they considered it, seemed to suit someone they had not yet met but already knew they would love entirely. Clara arrived in the world with the same immediate opacity as her brother, and with, additionally, a particular quality of focused attention that in a very young infant was startling enough to make the attending physician mention it with some bemusement. She looks at you, Marguerite observed at her first visit to meet the baby, as though she's already decided what she thinks of you. She's 3 days old, Sarah said. And she's already decided, Marguerite said serenely. James, at 2.5, adjusted to his sister with the philosophical practicality of a child who had been told this was happening, and had apparently concluded that the most efficient response was acceptance. He periodically brought her objects of interest, a carved wooden horse, a particularly smooth stone he valued, a half-eaten biscuit that was removed before delivery, and sat near her with the air of someone conducting a very thorough assessment of a new situation. By the time Clara was 6 months old, James had concluded his assessment favorably. The Dodge City of 1883 and 1884 was in transition, as all frontier towns eventually were. The cattle trade that had made it wild and famous was declining, as the rail lines pushed further west, and the cattle drives shortened, and the lawlessness of the early years gave way to the slower, steadier processes of a town becoming something permanent. Lionel had been part of that transition in his professional capacity, and he watched it with the particular perspective of someone who had known the town in both its versions. He wrote to his mother in Missouri that year, a long letter he had been composing in various iterations for some time, and told her that he was happy. He had not said those words in a letter to anyone in a long time, not because he had been dishonest, but because he had not had occasion for them. He told her about Sarah, about James and Clara, about the house and the study and the vegetable garden, and the fact that he had for the first time in his adult life a shelf of books that had been reorganized by color, and that he had chosen to leave that way. His mother wrote back that she would come to visit, and did that August, arriving on the Kansas Pacific Railway at the Dodge City Station. The same railway line that Lionel still thought of, sometimes with a private amusement, as the train on which everything had changed. She was a small, keen-eyed woman who had raised 4 children after his father's death with the particular iron pragmatism of frontier women, and she held her grandson and granddaughter with the careful, intense attentiveness of someone memorizing them. And she looked at Sarah across the dinner table the first evening and said, simply, "You are exactly who I hoped for," which was the kind of directness that Sarah recognized as a family trait, and which she received with the warmth it deserved. "She told me," Sarah reported to Lionel later that evening, while they were getting ready for bed and could hear his mother reading to James in the next room with considerable dramatic embellishment, "that you were a difficult case." "Did she elaborate?" he said. "She said that after Anna you were like a locked house, everything in order, all the windows shut, and no sign of occupancy." "That is an accurate description." She said she had been waiting for someone who would find the door. He was quiet for a moment, hanging his coat over the chair with the habitual precision that was as much a part of him as anything else. Then he looked at her with that direct, unguarded steadiness that still, 5 years into knowing each other, did something to her breathing. "I was not hiding the door," he said. "I was just not sure I had one anymore." He paused. "And then a woman in a widow's veil looked at me on a train platform, and every bit of the pretense fell away, and I thought, there is someone who does not have a door either. And perhaps that is the point of connection." She went to him across the small space of their bedroom and put her hands on his face, a gesture she had made 100 times by now, and he put his hands over hers, and they stood like that in the lamplight of their house in Dodge City, Kansas, 1884, with the sound of his mother's theatrical storytelling drifting through the wall and the small-hour sounds of a settled prairie town outside the window, and the weight and warmth of a life fully built around them. "We make a remarkably good team," she said, "for 2 people who met because I boarded a train under false pretenses." "I have always thought so," he said. "Particularly given that you told me within approximately 10 minutes that you were not going to be stopped by anything." "I told you nothing of the sort." "You handed me back my own question when I asked if you were in danger," he said. "You said, 'That depends on whether you intend to tell anyone where I am.' That was the most contained, elegant version of 'I will not be stopped' that I have ever encountered. It has become something of a personal standard." She laughed and kissed him, the kind of easy, unhurried kiss that was the specific property of people who have been kissing each other long enough to have no urgency about it and all the world of intention. In the room next door, his mother was telling James about a king and a horse and a great adventure, and James was asking detailed practical questions about the horse's diet and the king's sleeping arrangements, which had the quality of a conversation they could look forward to for the next 30 years. Clara, from her small crib in the corner of the room the children shared, was making the small, private sounds of a deeply satisfied person settling into sleep. The prairie night outside was enormous and full of stars. The house on the quiet street held all of it: the children, the books reorganized by color, the hat on the kitchen table, the vegetable garden sleeping under its autumn mulch, the study with its lamp still burning, the 2 people in the bedroom who had found each other on a train and chosen each other daily and fully and without reservation in all the days since. Sarah Yates, who had once walked 35 miles in the dark to keep herself from being owned, lay down in the bed of her own choosing next to the man who had seen through the disguise and chosen to care about what was underneath, and felt, with the complete and thorough certainty of someone who had known its absence long enough to recognize its presence, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Lionel Norris, who had lived for 6 years in the locked house of a grief managed but not resolved, who had learned to be sufficient to himself in ways that were real and also incomplete, who had noticed a pair of boots on a train platform and followed a hunch that turned into a woman who turned into the whole rest of his life, turned down the lamp and lay beside her and found, as he found every night, that the darkness of the Kansas night felt nothing like the absence it had once been. Outside, the stars were very bright over Dodge City. Inside, the life they had built out of a borrowed widow's veil and a U.S. Marshal's badge and a $63 tin box, and the stubborn, extraordinary decision that hope was worth the cost of it. That life continued, full and real and warmly, irreversibly ongoing, for all the long and ordinary and remarkable years that followed.